3 nights ago, I stood in a ballroom full of investors and watched my future son in law hand me a polished cleaning kit in front of hundreds of guests. He said it was a reminder of where I came from. The room laughed. My daughter froze. And for a moment, everyone believed the same thing he did, that I was just an old janitor who had wandered into a world far above her place. What none of them knew was that many of the buildings they worked in stood on land I quietly owned. I did not raise my voice that night. I simply started a 72-hour clock. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Doyle, and I am 66 years old. I have lived in the same modest house in Rainier Valley, a quiet neighborhood in Seattle, Washington, for more than 3 decades. Most mornings begin the same way for me. I wake before sunrise, open the kitchen window, and let the cool Pacific Northwest air drift through the house. The scent of damp cedar and distant salt from Elliott Bay always reminds me that this city has grown larger and faster than anyone imagined when I first arrived here as a young woman. To most people who know me, I am simply a retired janitor. For 40 years, I worked the night shift cleaning office buildings in downtown Seattle. I pushed a heavy cart filled with cleaning supplies through long hallways of glass and steel while the rest of the city slept. I emptied trash cans, polished conference tables, wiped fingerprints from windows, and vacuumed carpets that cost more than the car I used to drive. It was quiet work, invisible work. Most executives left before my shift began, and the few who stayed late rarely noticed the woman cleaning the floor beneath their feet. But being invisible has its advantages. When people believe you are not important, they stop paying attention to you. They speak freely. They forget you are in the room. Over the years, I heard conversations about things that shaped the future of Seattle. Executives argued about land deals, investors debated which neighborhoods would expand next, and developers discussed new transportation projects before the public ever heard about them. I never interrupted. I never asked questions. I simply listened while wiping down tables or sweeping the floor. At home, I kept a small notebook where I wrote down what I remembered. At first, it was just curiosity. Later, it became something more deliberate. I was raising my daughter Emily alone in those days, and money was always tight. Instead of spending what little I earned, I saved as much as I could. I learned to repair my own clothes and stretch groceries across the week. Every spare dollar went into a savings account that most people would have considered insignificant. After several years, I used that money to buy my first small investment, a neglected parking lot near an industrial block that no one believed had any future. The lot looked worthless at the time. Weeds grew through cracked asphalt, and a broken chain-link fence leaned toward the street. But I had overheard a conversation in a conference room about a planned transit expansion that would pass within walking distance of that block. I did not know much about real estate then, but I understood patience. That first purchase led to another. Years later, I bought a quiet warehouse near the harbor. Later still, a narrow strip of land near a proposed transit station. None of these properties seemed important when I purchased them. They were overlooked pieces of the city, ignored by people who preferred faster profits. I recorded every detail in a worn leather ledger that still sits on my kitchen table today. Over time, those small investments quietly multiplied. Companies formed, properties were leased, and land values rose as Seattle expanded. Yet, I never changed my lifestyle. I kept the same small house in Rainier Valley and the same simple morning routine. Remaining underestimated made life easier. Because when people assume you have nothing, they never realize how much you are actually holding. If you're still watching and curious about what happens next, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Because what seemed like an ordinary morning was about to be interrupted by a conversation that would change everything. Now let's move on to chapter 2. Later that same morning, the kitchen in my small Rainier Valley house settled back into its usual quiet rhythm. The coffee maker had long since stopped dripping, leaving the faint smell of roasted beans lingering in the air. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains above the sink, falling across the oak table where my old leather ledger rested open in front of me. The pages had softened over the years, their edges worn smooth from decades of careful use. I turned each page slowly, reading the handwritten notes that represented most of my adult life. Every entry was dated and detailed. A warehouse near Harbor Island, purchased in the early 1990s. A small parking lot along an industrial corridor that no one wanted at the time. A narrow parcel of land near a future transit station that had existed only as a rumor when I first wrote the entry down. The numbers beside those notes had changed many times over the years, but the ink remained the same. When I first began keeping the ledger, Seattle looked very different. Entire neighborhoods that now held sleek technology campuses had once been filled with rusted warehouses and empty storefronts. Developers ignored those areas because they wanted quicker returns somewhere else. That was the advantage of patience. When you are not in a hurry, you notice opportunities others walk past. I traced a finger across one entry near the middle of the book and allowed myself a small smile. That property alone now supported several companies whose employees probably believed the land beneath their office belonged to someone else entirely. Across the room, a photograph of my daughter Emily sat on the corner shelf beside the window. The picture had been taken when she graduated from law school. Her expression in that photograph carried the same quiet determination she had as a child. I felt a familiar wave of pride thinking about how far she had come. In a few days, she would be standing in a ballroom overlooking Elliott Bay, surrounded by colleagues and investors, preparing to begin a new chapter of her life. The sound of tires crunching against gravel broke my thoughts. I looked through the window and saw a sleek electric car rolling slowly into my driveway. Its polished body reflected the morning sunlight in sharp lines that looked out of place among the older houses on my street. When the driver stepped out, I immediately recognized Daniel Whitaker. Daniel was tall, confident, and dressed with the effortless polish that comes from working around money and influence. His shoes were too clean for a neighborhood like mine, and his jacket probably cost more than my entire living room set. When he stepped inside, his eyes moved quickly around the room before returning to me. It was a subtle movement, but I had spent too many years watching people to miss it. We spoke briefly about the wedding preparations. Daniel mentioned how many important guests would be attending the ceremony at the Grand Harbor Hotel. Venture capital partners from California, technology executives from several companies, a few investors who, according to him, rarely attended private events. As he spoke, his tone shifted into something that sounded carefully practiced. He suggested that the wedding reception might feel overwhelming for someone unfamiliar with that kind of social environment. A private lounge area would be available, he explained, where I could relax away from the main ballroom. A moment later, he added another idea. A developer he knew was interested in purchasing my property in Rainier Valley. The offer, he assured me, would allow me to move into a comfortable retirement residence where I would not have to maintain an aging house anymore. I poured myself another cup of coffee and listened without interrupting. After Daniel finished speaking, he thanked me politely and walked back to his car. The house grew quiet again once he drove away. I closed the ledger, turned to the final page, and stared at the phone number written there. Then I picked up the receiver and called Arthur Bennett. If you're still here, and the story is starting to pull you in, comment number 2 below so I know you're following along. Because the wedding hasn't even started yet, and the moment that truly exposes someone's character is still ahead. Now, let's continue to Chapter 3. 3 evenings later, I stood outside the entrance of the Grand Harbor Hotel in downtown Seattle and looked up at the glass tower reflecting the last light of sunset over Elliott Bay. The building shimmered with polished steel and tall windows that captured every glow of the waterfront skyline. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, and uniformed attendants moved quickly between them, opening doors for guests dressed in expensive suits and evening gowns. The air carried a faint mix of salt water from the bay and the perfume of fresh flowers arranged near the entrance. For a moment, I remained on the sidewalk, watching the crowd move through the doors. The quiet rhythm of Rainier Valley felt very far away. Inside the lobby, the sound of soft jazz floated through the air, while guests followed signs directing them toward the ballroom. The hallway carpets were thick and silent under my shoes. I passed large mirrors and polished marble columns that reflected the lights overhead in warm golden tones. When I stepped into the ballroom, the room opened wide in front of me, like a carefully staged theater. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, scattering light across a polished floor that gleamed beneath the guests' footsteps. Tall floral arrangements stood on every table, filled with white roses and pale blue hydrangeas. Waiters moved quietly through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne glasses that shimmered under the lights. The low hum of conversation blended with the music, creating the soft, confident sound of people who were comfortable in rooms like this. I paused near the entrance and let my eyes adjust to the scene. Near the center of the ballroom stood my daughter Emily. Her wedding dress caught the light every time she turned, the fabric moving like water as she spoke with a group of guests gathered around her. She looked calm and composed, though I knew the scale of the event must feel overwhelming. Emily had always carried herself with a quiet confidence, even as a child. Seeing her standing there now filled me with a kind of pride that settled deep in my chest. Across the room, I noticed Daniel Whitaker. He stood near the bar surrounded by several men in tailored suits, speaking animatedly while holding a glass of champagne. Daniel had a natural way of drawing attention to himself. His posture was relaxed, his smile confident, and every few seconds, he gestured toward someone in the room as if the entire evening were part celebration and part business meeting. Eventually, his eyes moved across the ballroom and stopped on me. He excused himself from the group and walked over with a practiced smile. After greeting me, he guided me toward the men he had been speaking with. They were venture capital investors visiting from California, people whose companies had funded technology startups across the West Coast. Daniel introduced me with a tone that sounded both friendly and performative. He explained that I had spent most of my life working night shifts, cleaning office buildings in Seattle while raising Emily on my own. The story was delivered with a casual warmth that suggested admiration, but I could hear the subtle emphasis he placed on each detail. Several of the men nodded politely. One offered a brief smile that lingered somewhere between respect and curiosity. I said very little. Instead, I studied the room. Many of the guests standing beneath those chandeliers believed they understood wealth and influence better than anyone else in the city. Yet, several companies represented in that ballroom operated on land that had once appeared in the pages of my ledger. Daniel continued speaking with easy confidence beside me, unaware that the ground beneath his carefully planned evening had been shifting long before the wedding invitations were printed. If you're still watching and want to see how this night unfolds, comment number 3 below to let me know you're still with me, because what happens next in that ballroom will shift the entire room in a way no one expects. Now, let's move on to Chapter 4. The reception continued with the easy confidence of an event designed to impress everyone in the room. Conversations drifted through the ballroom like low waves beneath the music. Waiters moved between tables, refilling glasses, and the soft glow of chandeliers reflected against polished marble and silverware. From where I stood near the edge of the room, the entire evening looked like a carefully choreographed performance. Clusters of guests spoke about venture capital funding, new technology startups, and the constant expansion of Seattle's waterfront districts. Some discussed office towers rising near South Lake Union, while others debated which companies would dominate the next decade of artificial intelligence development. Their voices carried the relaxed certainty of people accustomed to shaping the future of a city. I listened quietly. Several of the company names drifting through those conversations were familiar to me, though the speakers did not know why. Across the ballroom, a wedding coordinator approached Emily and gently guided her toward the head table. The band softened its music, signaling that the formal part of the evening was about to begin. Guests began returning to their seats, their conversations fading into a polite hush as attention turned toward the small stage prepared at the front of the room. Daniel stepped onto the stage a moment later. He held a microphone in one hand and a champagne glass in the other, smiling with the comfortable confidence of someone who enjoyed an audience. When he began speaking, his voice carried easily across the room. He thanked the guests for attending the wedding and spoke warmly about Emily, describing how proud he was to build a future with her. The crowd responded with approving smiles and quiet applause. For the first few minutes, his words sounded exactly like what people expect during a wedding speech. Then the tone shifted. Daniel began talking about how success often grows from humble beginnings. He described the importance of remembering where people come from, even after they reach positions of influence. As he spoke, he mentioned my name. Several heads in the room turned toward me. Daniel told the guests that I had spent decades working as a janitor in office buildings throughout Seattle while raising Emily alone. His voice carried a light warmth that sounded almost admiring, yet every sentence seemed carefully arranged to highlight the distance between my past and the luxury surrounding the ballroom. Then he gestured toward one of the hotel staff members standing nearby. A large decorative box, wrapped with gold ribbon, was carried onto the stage and placed beside him. The room grew curious as Daniel explained that he had prepared a special gift for his new mother-in-law. When he opened the box, the contents caught the light from the chandeliers above. Inside rested a polished cleaning kit displayed neatly beneath clear glass. The handles of the tools were metallic and bright, arranged like a collector's set. A few guests laughed softly, unsure whether the moment was meant as humor or tribute. I felt the attention of the entire ballroom settle in my direction. Emily's posture stiffened slightly near the head table. For a moment, I remained seated, watching Daniel carefully. His expression carried the relaxed satisfaction of someone who believed he had just delivered a clever gesture. Then I stood. The walk to the stage felt longer than it truly was. The quiet murmur of the room faded with each step until the ballroom grew almost completely silent. When I reached the stage, I looked briefly at the cleaning kit resting in its glass display. Then I turned toward Daniel and asked for the microphone. He handed it to me with an easy smile, certain he understood how the moment would unfold. I faced the crowd and spoke calmly. I explained that Daniel was correct about one thing. I had spent many years cleaning floors in the city. But when you clean buildings long enough, you begin to notice things other people miss. You see how companies grow, how deals are whispered across conference tables, and how cities quietly transform over time. The ballroom remained silent after my last sentence. Hundreds of eyes rested on the stage, yet no one moved or spoke. The soft music from the band had stopped completely, leaving only the faint sound of glasses being set down on tables somewhere near the back of the room. Daniel stood beside me, still holding his champagne glass. A few moments earlier, he had looked perfectly comfortable under the lights. Now, his smile seemed uncertain, as if he was trying to decide whether the moment was still part of the joke he believed he had created. I held the microphone steadily and continued. I told the guests that Daniel had described my life accurately in one sense. I had indeed spent many years cleaning office buildings across Seattle. I explained that those night shifts had taken me through dozens of glass towers and conference rooms while the rest of the city slept. The work was quiet, repetitive, and mostly invisible. But invisibility, I said, can be an education. When you move through offices after midnight, people forget you are there. Executives continue their conversations while packing up documents. Investors argue over financial projections before heading home. Developers talk openly about the next neighborhood they plan to reshape. I spent decades listening to those conversations while polishing tables and emptying trash cans. Over time, I began to understand how cities change. I described how certain parts of Seattle once looked forgotten. Harbor warehouses, empty parking lots, narrow strips of land near proposed transit routes. Most investors ignored those places because they preferred projects that promised faster profits. I had a different advantage. Patience. With the money I saved from those night shifts, I began purchasing small pieces of property that no one else wanted. A neglected parking lot near an industrial corridor, a warehouse close to Harbor Island. Later, a parcel of land beside a transit route that had not yet been approved. I paused and looked out across the ballroom. Several guests had stopped pretending to sip their drinks. I told them that those early investments eventually became the foundation of a quiet company built through multiple holding firms. The company operates under the name Harbor Legacy Holdings. A faint ripple of recognition moved through the room. Harbor Legacy was not widely discussed in public, but people in certain financial circles knew the name. The firm owned significant land positions across Seattle, often appearing only as a quiet partner in development projects. I explained that privacy had always been my preference. I had no interest in magazine interviews or public recognition. Remaining unseen allowed me to observe carefully and invest patiently. Daniel shifted slightly beside me. For the first time since I had taken the stage, he looked directly at me instead of the crowd. I continued calmly. Over the past several years, Harbor Legacy had leased land to various development groups throughout the city. Some of those projects involved new office spaces, waterfront properties, and mixed-use technology campuses. I allowed a small pause before finishing the thought. Several of those developments, I said, happened to involve investment partnerships connected to Daniel's firm. The meaning settled slowly across the ballroom. I explained that misunderstandings often happen when people believe they already know someone's entire story. Appearances can be convincing, especially when they fit comfortably into expectations. Then I looked briefly at the polished cleaning kit, still resting inside its glass display box. Sometimes, I said quietly, the person cleaning the building understands its foundation better than the people working in the offices above it. I handed the microphone back to Daniel. Without another word, I stepped down from the stage and walked back toward the tables while the room struggled to absorb what had just been revealed. The silence that followed my speech lingered in the ballroom long after I stepped down from the stage. The chandeliers above continued to scatter warm light across the room, but the energy had shifted. Conversations that had once flowed easily now moved in cautious murmurs. As I returned to my seat, I noticed several guests watching me with quiet curiosity. A few of the investors who had been speaking with Daniel earlier were no longer smiling. Instead, they leaned together, whispering while glancing toward the stage where Daniel still stood. Emily reached me first. Her dress brushed softly against the floor, as she walked quickly across the room. Up close, I could see the tension in her eyes, though she kept her voice calm when she spoke. She asked if what I had said about Harbor Legacy Holdings was true. I told her that it was. For a moment, she studied my face, as if measuring something she had suspected, but never fully confirmed. Then she nodded slowly. There was no anger in her expression, only a complicated mixture of surprise and understanding. Across the ballroom, Daniel tried to regain control of the moment. He lifted the microphone again and attempted to continue his speech. His words sounded polished, but the rhythm had changed. The audience responded with polite attention rather than the warm laughter he had received earlier. A few guests clapped lightly when he finished, though the applause felt restrained. Once he stepped down from the stage, the reception continued, but the tone of the room had shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. Some guests approached Daniel with careful smiles, yet others drifted toward different conversations. I noticed several people quietly checking their phones, likely searching for information about Harbor Legacy Holdings. The name carried weight in certain circles, even if few people knew who was behind it. A man near the bar spoke quietly to another guest about property leases connected to development projects along the waterfront. The moment he mentioned Harbor Legacy, both men glanced toward me. Daniel moved through the room with determined confidence, but the difference in his posture was subtle and unmistakable. The ease he carried earlier had been replaced with something more measured. He was beginning to understand that the evening had shifted beyond a simple joke. By the time the reception began to wind down, I slipped out of the ballroom without drawing attention. The night air outside the hotel felt cooler than before. The quiet streets of downtown Seattle were nearly empty as I drove back toward Rainier Valley. When I arrived home, the familiar creak of the front door and the dim kitchen light greeted me like an old friend. I sat down at the oak table and opened my leather ledger. The pages looked exactly as they had that morning, steady and patient. For decades, that book had recorded every decision that slowly shaped my life. A few minutes later, the telephone rang. Arthur Bennett's voice carried a low sense of curiosity. News from the wedding had already begun circulating among several investors who attended the reception. He mentioned that Harbor Legacy's connection to certain development projects was now a topic of quiet conversation. Arthur asked whether I planned to take any action regarding Daniel's firm. I told him that I had no interest in revenge, but I did believe that business relationships deserve careful review, especially when arrogance blinds someone to the foundation supporting their success. I asked Arthur to begin examining the partnership agreements tied to Daniel's projects. After the call ended, I closed the ledger and looked out the window at the quiet street. Daniel likely believed the evening's embarrassment was already behind him. He did not yet understand that the 72-hour clock had already begun. If you're still watching and want to see what the 72-hour clock is really going to do, comment number 6 below so I know you're still here, because what begins happening behind the scenes next will quietly shake an entire career. Now let's move on to Chapter 7. The next morning began like most mornings in my house in Rainier Valley. I woke before sunrise and stood at the kitchen sink while the coffee brewed behind me. The neighborhood was still quiet. A thin layer of sage drifted across the streetlights, and the city skyline in the distance looked soft and gray against the early sky. For a few minutes, I simply watched the street through the window. The previous evening at the Grand Harbor Hotel felt strangely distant already, as if it had happened in another world entirely. Ballrooms and chandeliers belonged to a different rhythm of life than the one I had built over the years. Yet the conversation that started there had already begun traveling through places where decisions carried real weight. I poured a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table with my leather ledger. The book had become a habit over decades. Every property, every lease, every agreement connected to Harbor Legacy Holdings had been written down inside its pages. When I turned through the entries, the city of Seattle unfolded across the paper in quiet lines of ink. A parking structure near Pioneer Square, a warehouse complex near Harbor Island, several parcels of land along the developing technology corridor north of downtown. Many of those properties were now connected to large development projects, including some managed by Daniel's investment firm. Around mid-morning, the telephone rang. Arthur Bennett's voice carried the calm focus of someone who had already been working for hours. He explained that he had spent the morning reviewing partnership agreements tied to Daniel's firm and the Harbor Legacy properties connected to those projects. The review had revealed several details worth examining more closely. Daniel's firm, Arthur explained, had structured multiple developments under the assumption that their long-term access to Harbor Legacy land would remain unchanged. Those properties formed the foundation beneath several technology offices and mixed-use complexes currently under construction. If those agreements were questioned or renegotiated, the financial stability of those projects could shift quickly. Arthur also mentioned something else. Several investors who attended the wedding reception had already contacted his office. The speech from the ballroom had spread through private conversations among venture capital groups overnight. Some of those investors were now reviewing their commitments to Daniel's projects. Confidence, in the investment world, can be fragile. I asked Arthur a few quiet questions about the agreements themselves. I wanted to know how they had been negotiated and whether Daniel's firm had built its plans on assumptions rather than secure guarantees. Arthur told me he would begin a full audit of the partnerships immediately. The process would take time, but the first details could be ready within a day. I thanked him and ended the call. The kitchen grew quiet again. I opened the ledger and turned to the pages connected to those developments. Each entry carried notes written years apart, small reminders of how the land had been acquired long before anyone imagined the towers now rising above it. From the window, I could see the distant outline of downtown Seattle through the thinning fog. Somewhere in one of those glass buildings, Daniel Whitaker had likely arrived at his office expecting a normal workday. He probably believed the uncomfortable moment at the wedding had ended when the music resumed. But reputations move quickly in financial circles, and confidence can change direction faster than most people expect. The 72-hour clock was still running. The afternoon passed quietly in my house in Rainier Valley, though I knew the calm around me did not reflect what was unfolding across the city. Sunlight moved slowly across the kitchen floor while I sat at the table with my ledger open, reviewing several entries tied to Harbor Legacy Holdings. The same pages I had written years earlier were now connected to projects worth millions of dollars. Outside, a delivery truck rolled down the street, and a neighbor waved as she carried groceries into her home. Life in my neighborhood followed a steady rhythm that had not changed much in decades. It reminded me that the loudest decisions shaping a city are often made far away from the places where ordinary people live their lives. I spent part of the afternoon reviewing property files connected to several development projects along Seattle's waterfront and technology corridor. Many of those projects involved land leased from Harbor Legacy through subsidiary companies that had been created long before Daniel Whitaker entered the investment world. Around 3 o'clock, the telephone rang again. Arthur Bennett sounded more focused than he had earlier that morning. His team had continued examining the partnership agreements tied to Daniel's firm, and the audit had already revealed structural weaknesses in several projects. According to Arthur, Daniel's company had built its expansion plans around the expectation that their access to Harbor Legacy land would remain stable for many years. The agreements themselves, however, allowed periodic review under specific conditions. Arthur explained that once those clauses were noticed by Daniel's financial partners, the reaction had been immediate. Several investors who attended the wedding had already contacted Daniel's firm requesting clarification about their exposure to Harbor Legacy-controlled properties. Even those who had not attended the reception had begun hearing the story through industry conversations. Confidence, Arthur said, had begun to shift. I asked whether Daniel had tried to reach Harbor Legacy directly. Arthur confirmed that several messages had arrived through official business channels that morning. Daniel had requested meetings and explanations about the situation, but Harbor Legacy's legal department was still reviewing the requests as part of the ongoing audit. I told Arthur to continue the review exactly as planned. My intention was not to dismantle Daniel's firm out of anger. Business decisions, especially those affecting entire developments and hundreds of workers, required careful understanding. If Daniel's partnerships had been negotiated responsibly, the projects would continue without disruption. If they had not, the agreements themselves would reveal the truth. After we finished speaking, the house grew quiet again. I stepped outside onto the front porch and sat for a while, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the street. Children rode bicycles past the corner, their voices echoing between the houses. A few neighbors returned home from work and waved as they walked up their driveways. The simplicity of the neighborhood felt grounding. Somewhere in downtown Seattle, inside a tower of glass and conference rooms, Daniel Whitaker was likely realizing that the conversation begun at his wedding had not ended when the music resumed. Financial systems rarely move quickly at first, but once a doubt enters the conversation, momentum builds faster than most people expect. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, I returned inside and closed my ledger. The 72-hour clock was approaching its final stage. If you're still with me and ready to see how this story finally ends, comment number 8 below, so I know you're here for the conclusion. Because the final pieces are about to fall into place, and the outcome will reveal the true weight of those 72 hours. Now, let's move on to the final chapters of the story. The third morning after the wedding arrived quietly over Rainier Valley. The sky was pale and overcast, the kind of gray morning Seattle seemed to wear comfortably. I stood in my kitchen as the coffee brewed, watching a thin mist drift across the rooftops of the neighborhood. For decades, my mornings had followed the same steady rhythm. Wake early, brew coffee, review the ledger. Some habits do not change, even when the rest of the world moves quickly. I sat at the oak table and opened the worn leather book in front of me. The pages carried entries written across many years. Each line represented a decision made slowly and deliberately. A warehouse acquired when the Harbor District was nearly abandoned. A narrow strip of land purchased before a transit line even existed on city planning maps. Those decisions had never felt dramatic when I made them. They were simply patient choices. The telephone rang shortly after sunrise. Arthur Bennett spoke with the calm tone of someone delivering a conclusion rather than speculation. His team had completed the review of Harbor Legacy's partnerships connected to Daniel Whitaker's investment firm. The audit confirmed what he had suspected earlier in the week. Daniel's company had structured several major developments around assumptions that were never fully secured. Many of the projects depended heavily on land leased from Harbor Legacy subsidiaries. Investors working with Daniel had believed those arrangements were stable long-term agreements. In reality, several contracts contained review clauses that allowed changes under certain conditions. Once investors understood that detail, confidence shifted quickly. Arthur explained that multiple financial partners had already withdrawn funding from upcoming development phases tied to Daniel's firm. Without those commitments, several high-profile projects would struggle to continue. The reaction inside Daniel's company had been immediate. Partners began questioning the structure of the deals and the decisions that allowed those vulnerabilities to exist. Over the previous 2 days, Daniel had attempted to reassure investors through meetings and phone calls, But the situation had moved beyond simple explanations. The incident at the wedding had already placed his judgment under quiet scrutiny. The financial revelations only strengthened those concerns. Arthur paused briefly before explaining the final development. Daniel's firm had decided to restructure its leadership in an effort to stabilize investor confidence. As part of that restructuring, Daniel had been asked to step away from his position managing the firm's investment partnerships. For a moment, I remained silent with the receiver in my hand. There was no satisfaction in the news, only a quiet recognition of how quickly reputations can change when confidence disappears. After the call ended, I closed the ledger and stepped outside onto my front porch. The street looked exactly as it had the day before. A neighbor walked her dog past the corner mailbox. A delivery truck rolled slowly along the block before stopping near a small house across the street. Life in Rainier Valley moved forward. I walked slowly toward the small park at the end of the street, letting the cool air settle around me. The city skyline rose faintly in the distance, its towers hidden partly by the morning mist. Somewhere in one of those glass buildings, Daniel Whitaker was beginning a very different morning than the one he expected when he stood in that ballroom days earlier. But the consequences unfolding now had not been created by my response. They had grown from the foundation he believed was stronger than it truly was. By the time I returned home, the 72-hour window had quietly closed. By late afternoon, the sky above Rainier Valley had turned the soft silver color that Seattle often carries before evening. I returned home from my walk and stepped into the quiet kitchen that had been the center of my life for so many years. The familiar creak of the floorboards and the faint smell of coffee from the morning still lingered in the air. I filled the kettle and placed it on the stove, moving through the same routine that had shaped countless ordinary days. Outside the window, the neighborhood remained calm. A car passed slowly down the street, and somewhere nearby, a dog barked once before the sound faded again into the quiet. On the kitchen table sat the leather ledger. The book looked exactly the same as it had that morning, its worn edges and faded pages holding the record of decisions made across decades. I sat down and opened it carefully, turning to the final page where the most recent entries rested. For a while, I simply looked at the lines of ink. The past 72 hours had carried more attention than most of my life ever had. Yet nothing about the room around me had changed. The same small house, the same table, the same quiet neighborhood that had always grounded me. Daniel Whitaker had believed the world was built on visible success, expensive suits, impressive introductions, rooms filled with people who believed they were standing at the center of power. But the truth I learned long ago while pushing a cleaning cart through silent office hallways was different. Real influence rarely announces itself. I remembered those long nights in downtown buildings when the offices were empty except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Conversations drifted through conference rooms while I polished glass tables and wiped down counters. Investors discussed properties they believed would never matter. Developers talked openly about which neighborhoods would rise and which would fade away. They never noticed the woman cleaning the room. Over time, I realized that information is like water. It flows quietly, filling spaces that others overlook. If you are patient enough to watch where it gathers, you begin to understand how entire cities change. Daniel's mistake had not been the joke he made at the wedding. People say foolish things when they want to impress a crowd. His real mistake was believing that status always reveals the true structure of power. Foundations are rarely visible from the top of a building. I picked up my pen and wrote one final line beneath the last entry in the ledger. The words were simple, the same kind of note I had written many times before when a matter reached its natural conclusion. 72 hours complete. After closing the book, I carried my tea to the window and watched as evening lights began appearing across the distant Seattle skyline. Towers of glass and steel rose against the fading sky, each one standing on land that someone had once overlooked. From the outside, those buildings looked permanent and powerful. But every structure depends on the strength of what lies beneath it. And the people who understand, sometimes life reminds us that true strength does not live in titles, applause, or the rooms where powerful people gather. It lives quietly in patience, discipline, and the choices made when no one is watching. The world often celebrates the spotlight, yet the strongest foundations are built far from it, one careful decision at a time. Respect, humility, and awareness of others are not small virtues. They are the invisible structures that hold every success in place. When those foundations are ignored, even the tallest towers can lose their balance. But when they are honored, a life can stand steady no matter how the world changes around it. Thank you for spending this time with the story. If it left you with a thought or reflection, share it in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you enjoy stories like this, consider following and subscribing so you never miss the next one.